Welcome to this Aztlander presentation, the Newark Earthworks and the Great Hopewell Road with Brad Lepper, Senior Archaeologist, World Heritage Program, and the Ohio History Connection. Take it away, Brad.
Okay, well, thanks for the introduction, Jim, and thanks for the invitation to be here tonight. And thanks to everybody out there in the web, wherever you are, and listening to the program. I'm glad you could be here. So, yes, my program tonight is about the Newark Earthworks and the Great Hopewell Road. They are integrally related. And the Newark Earthworks are, as stated, one component. Actually, the Newark Earthworks are two components. That is, the Great Circle Earthwork and the Octagon Earthworks are two components of the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks UNESCO World Heritage Site. The Great Circle and Octagon are part of one formerly connected and vast earthwork complex that's referred to as the Newark Earthworks. But because they're separate now, have been the intervening spaces have been urbanized. They are considered two separate components. And in addition to that, there's the Fort Ancient Earthworks down in Warren County. Those three sites are owned and operated by the Ohio History Connection. And then the other five sites that make up the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks are the five sites that comprise Hopewell Culture National Historical Park. And I'll mention at some point probably all of them. One thing you'll notice from this map, though, is that the Newark Earthworks are the northernmost of any of these gigantic enclosures. And I'll be making the argument that they are sort of the grand synthesis of Hopewell astronomy, geometry, ceremony, ritual, in spite of the fact that they are sort of widely separate from what's generally referred to as the Hopewell core. That is that region in the Scioto Valley and some of the other river valleys that flow south into the Ohio River down in southern Ohio. So the Newark Earthworks are special, and I think, if I'm right, the Great Hopewell Road is a direct connection that ties the Newark Earthworks to those other sites. Of course, there's also geometry and astronomy that tie them together as well. And this earthwork complex, this Hopewell culture, as it's called, extends from about 1 to 400 CE. And you can see some of the monumental architecture around there. That's the Fort Ancient on the left on the top, the Cyper Earthworks below it, the Octagon Earthworks on the upper right, and the lower right is the Mound City Group. So to become a World Heritage Site, you have to have outstanding universal value. And of course, much of the outstanding universal value of these sites lies in their monumental architecture and the fact that it's earthen architecture on a scale that rivals anything else being built at this time, and also includes astronomical alignments as well as a sophisticated geometry. In addition, sort of another component of the outstanding universal value is what you see here, this vast interaction sphere. That is, we think the Hopewell culture in Southern Ohio was the center of a religious movement that had ties and that tied together much of North America. And in fact, these are ceremonial items of regalia here that were made out of these special raw materials that were being brought to Ohio from, quite literally, as you can see, the ends of their world. So shark teeth, mica from the Atlantic coast, shells from the Gulf of Mexico, copper and silver from southern Canada, and even all the way out in the Rocky Mountains of Wyoming, obsidian, this black volcanic glass. And I'll make an argument that comes out of my Newark Earthworks research that this isn't a trade network as I was initially taught when I was an undergraduate. It's something quite different that we'll get to later on. So other aspects of the outstanding universal value, these gigantic earthworks were not cities. The communities that came together here lived in small dispersed communities that are not even villages. Archaeologists don't even call them villages because they're small. They're couple houses. You can almost think of them as homesteads. Most archaeologists refer to them as hamlets. but they're small little communities with the people hunted, fished, and gathered, but also had gardens, but no corn yet. Corn doesn't come into Ohio until about AD or 900 CE. So they're growing the plants of the Eastern agricultural complex, and it's an important component of their diet. Also, in addition to no cities, there were no authoritarian leaders, no kings or emperors, and no written language that we know of. But I think implicit in some of the archaeoastronomy, for example, suggests they must have been recording information in some manner for generations. So they have all these things, or they're missing all these things, I guess, in terms of comparable civilizations at the same time period. And yet, in spite of not having cities or kings or agriculture on a large basis or written language, nevertheless, they have this incredible monumental architecture. And this is an artist's conception of what the Newark earthworks may have looked like at around AD 300. We don't have very many radiocarbon dates for Newark, but the few we do have suggest it's rather late, like around 300 as opposed to AD 1. And I think I'll provide some information later that I think corroborates the fact that this is probably late. I think most of the geometry in astronomy was developed or originated in the Scioto Valley and then was only later sort of put together and moved 60 miles north to this area of Newark, Ohio, that's very close to Flint Ridge Flint, which is probably one of the reasons for that movement. Flint Ridge Flint is the signature flint for the Hopewell culture. So having a center much closer to that would have made sense for a number of reasons. So this is a quote from Dr. John Hancock, an architectural historian now retired from the University of Cincinnati, although he's still active. He's the one that first sort of got us focused on these earthworks as architecture. And he says it's a kind of an architecture that's totally different from any of the architecture he'd been taught in grad school. He says Ohio's ancient earthworks are almost equally incomprehensible, at least to us in the Western tradition, as works of architecture or as landscape experiences. And I can affirm that. I mean, I know from the general public that I interact with over the years. In fact, one of my worst stories, I suppose, comes from when I was barely hired at the Ohio History Connection. I was hired in 1978 to be the curator and site archaeologist for the Newark Earthworks. And my office was a small office in a little museum building here at what is the Great Circle earthwork. And right across the street, just to the left of the picture, is this State Route 79 that runs through Newark and neighboring Heath. And there was a car dealership literally right across the street from the earthworks. And my wife and I and our small, then very young kids had just moved to Newark, settling in. We decided we needed a second car. She's over there with the boys, trying to see how cheaply she can get a car. And the dealer is chatting her up. Oh, what do you do? What does your husband do? And my young son pipes up, my daddy's an archaeologist. And he says, oh, really? And my wife says, yeah, he works at the mounds. And he looks at her and says, what mounds? And she literally points across the street at what you're seeing here at the Great Circle. And he follows the finger, but all he sees is a grassy slope with trees. He doesn't see ancient architecture. And this in a city that has mound builders, dairy bar, mound builders mall, Indian Mound Mall rather, mound builders pizza, all these establishments named after mounds. You'd think that would have conveyed something to the car dealer that mounds have something to do with this community. But he didn't think that was it. He probably thought of mounds as like the Adena conical burial mounds, and that didn't fit that conception. So this is unusual. John Hancock would call it uncanny architecture because of its scale, but simultaneously it's really great and precision. So these are nearly perfect circles, in some cases as perfect as we could build them, but they wouldn't have to be because of their scale. 2,000 years ago, people going through it would still see a circle, even if it was a little bit off. But yet they've made them, in some cases, perfect geometric figures. I talked about the scale, and here are some other World Heritage sites that I want to use for comparison, because that map there is one of the early maps of the Newark Earthworks. This actually appeared in Ephraim Squire and Edwin Davis's Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley. So that was the very first publication of the Smithsonian, which is kind of neat. But you've got the circle and the octagon earthworks in the upper left. You've got the great circle at the bottom. Then you've got the square that leads, you can follow from the great circle by those sort of converging and then parallel walls into the square. And then if you go beyond the square, there's what Squire and Davis represented as kind of a horseshoe-shaped earthwork with burial mounds clustered inside it. We know from better maps that that sort of horseshoe-shaped embankment was an elliptical embankment, sort of like Mound City, which is a rectangular or a square embankment with rounded corners. In this case, it's an ellipse, but they were all sort of jammed with these burial mounds. So that in the upper right, the Cherry Valley ellipse, was the focus of mortuary activity. Almost all the rest of the mounds here are not burial mounds, although they're connected by ceremonial avenues to the burial mounds. They're architecture, and we'll talk some more about them later. But so, for example, lower right, you can probably see the pyramid there. That's the Great Pyramid of Egypt. It would fit comfortably in the square that's next to it there. Up in the left-hand corner, the Roman Colosseum. In just the octagon, not counting the circle that's attached to it, you could put 4 Roman Colosseums inside that octagon. And if you look at the little circle along the lower southern boundary of the octagon, you could put Stonehenge inside that little circle, which of course is only little because it's next to this gigantic octagon. That gives you maybe a better sense of just how enormous this is. These earthworks spanned 4.5 square miles, and a conservative estimate based on this map suggested that what was it, 4.5 square miles, 7 million cubic feet of earth were used to construct it. And of course, the technology that they used to construct it was very simple: 0.6 clamshell hose and baskets. And these people were also soil scientists. They knew where to get the best soils to build monuments of the soils that were the right color or the right texture, to build these monuments that have endured for 2,000 years. So this, I'm going back to that map. This is the sort of our base map. It's an iconic map. This is what the Newark Earthworks would have looked like floating in a hot air balloon in 1848. And the next slide is going to be what it looks like today. So you can see there's very little left. You see at the bottom center, the circle, the little island of green, that's the Great Circle. And in the upper left, you see what looks like a golf course, which in fact, at the time this picture was taken, it was a golf course of the circle connected to the octagon. Those are the only 2 major components of the Newark Earthworks that have been preserved. The Great Circle was preserved because the county made it the county fairgrounds. The circle and octagon was preserved initially because local residents voted to raise their taxes, to raise money, to buy the property, to save it, and then they offered it to the state to be used as the state campgrounds for the state militia. And that scheme worked for everybody, but after 8 or 9 years, the state militia outgrew the site, and they moved up to Camp Perry on Lake Erie, and then it sort of left a vacuum. And the state turned the property of the Circle and Octagon over to what's called the Newark Board of Trade, which is kind of like a chamber of commerce. And they got to vote on what would happen to that property. And the community really wanted it to be a public park. There was a country club that wanted it to be a golf course and a country club. And apparently, as a historian at the OSU Newark campus, Ohio State University Newark campus, has pointed out, all the members of the Newark Board of Trade were members of the country club. So, of course, they voted to make it a golf course. That golf course opened in 1911, and it was a golf course until January 1st of this past year. So it's now fully open to the public. There is still golf course infrastructure, but as I like to say, it's healing every day. And if you haven't seen it, I hope many of you can come and experience both of these sites, as well as some of the other components of the Hopewell ceremonial earthworks. So some of the geometry that's incorporated into the earthworks, the circumference of the Great Circle is equal to the perimeter of the square that it's attached to. Now, I don't think this kind of knowledge would have been evident to all the people that would have been coming to the earthworks. I think there was some sort of ceremonial, perhaps not guild, but some sort of society, a ceremonial society that would have had varying levels of initiation into the mysteries, if you will. So some of those people who were maybe involved in designing the earthworks knew about all this embedded geometry, and as you'll see later, astronomy. But it's not necessarily important that everybody knew it. And it just sort of adds to the mystery, I think, to have those levels. So those two, in addition to being connected by these parallel walled networks of roads, the Great Circle and the square have that hidden geometrical connection. Sort of more interesting, the area of that perfect square is equal to the area of the perfect circle that's connected to the octagon. And that's called the observatory circle. It's been called that since the days that Squire and Davis did this map, and it wasn't because they knew anything about astronomical alignments. It was because there's a mound which you can sort of just see on the sort of the southwestern side of the circle there that's called Observatory Mound. And it was even called that back then because it's a high mound about twice as high as the rest of the earthwork. And people called it Observatory Mound because if you got up on it, you got a good observation view of the earthworks. Now, of course, that name has an entirely new significance. And then finally, the area of the Great Circle is equal to the area of a square that you could draw inside the octagon by drawing lines from alternate corners of the octagon. So that's even a more deeply embedded, a more deeply hidden square or geometric connection between those two features. Interestingly, the sides of that square are equal to the diameter of the circle to which it's attached. And that's called the observatory circle. And that diameter is 1,054 feet. The astronomy that's found there was not known until around 1980. And it's worth going into a little digression to talk about this because these are the two guys that figured it out, that rediscovered it. That's Ray Hively on the right, a physicist and astronomer at Earlham College in Indiana, and Bob Horn on the left. He was a philosopher at Earlham. They're team teaching a class back in the late 70s on cosmology. And this is just about the time Gerald Hawkins had written his book on Stonehenge Decoded, which presented Stonehenge as a sort of an elaborate astronomical computer. And what's fascinating is Ray and Bob didn't believe it. They said ancient people weren't that smart. They weren't paying attention to that much to what was going on in the sky. It's just that Stonehenge is a very complicated monument, and you can draw all kinds of lines through it. And just by happenstance, some of those lines happen to point to the summer solstice or the equinox. And so they said basically, if you put Stonehenge on a roulette wheel and spun it 1,000 times, 996 or 997 times out of 1,000, you could find these alignments. So it's just essentially haphazard. It's just random that these alignments are showing up. And they wanted to incorporate this notion in as a critical thinking exercise in their course. And they brought their students to Newark because Bob Horn had been to Newark. He saw that the Octagon was also a complicated site. 8 different gateways, 8 different sides of the Octagon, all with alignments. So they said, we'll go there. We'll say, oh, look, here's an alignment to the summer solstice sunrise. But it's just by chance. It's not that these people were that interested in the sky. So they do their survey, they draw every line they could think of, and there were no alignments to the sun. And they were astonished at that. They said that's statistically significant. And so they began wondering, well, maybe it's not lined up to the sun because it's lined up to something else. So they began looking at the moon. And what they found, uh, before I got into this, I had no idea there was a lunar cycle or anything. So I can't give you a great explanation about this. But in terms of on the ground, what you see, um, if you're looking at the eastern horizon, and this is quite analogous to the sun, the summer solstice sunrise is where the sun rises at its northernmost point on the eastern horizon. The winter solstice sunrise is where the sun rises at its northern point. And the sun cycles up and down over the course of a year. And it's a rhythm we all understand. It's the rhythm of the seasons. It turns out the moon does the same thing. It has a northernmost rise, and then it has a southernmost rise, and then it comes back to where it starts. But that angle changes from month to month over an 18.6-year-long cycle. So you end up with 4 points on the eastern horizon, the northernmost rise of the moon and the southernmost rise of the moon, and that's a really wide angle. And then 9.3 years later, the northernmost rise of the moon for that month is at its southernmost point, and the southernmost rise of the moon for that month is at its northernmost point. So that angle is very small. And then 9.3 years later, you're back to the maximums again. So 4 points on the eastern horizon, four corresponding points on the western horizon where the moon sets at its northernmost and southernmost and northern minimum and southern minimum points. And it turns out, as you see from this rather complicated diagram, that alignments to all of those alignments to the moon are embedded in the circle and octagon at Newark. And Ray Hively and Bob Horn were gobsmacked, astonished to find this. And they still weren't like, could this possibly be by chance? So they went and looked at the other circle and octagon in Chillicothe, which is High Bank Works. Oh, but first, view of the actual northernmost rise of the moon, or a nearly northernmost rise of the moon, rising in alignment with that parallel walled avenue. So you're standing at the gateway. Behind you is the observatory circle, and in front of you is the octagon with a small platform mound at the opening there. And if you could project the sun behind those trees going down to the point on the horizon, it's rising at basically the center point of that avenue, of that axis. So that's what it can actually look like. Here's the High Bank Works circle and octagon. The circle is 1,054 feet in diameter, the same size and the same precision as the observatory circle. The octagon is much smaller, but it also has all of those lunar alignments as well as a couple of solar alignments. And we know from other archaeoastronomy work at other Hopewell sites, they didn't ignore the sun at all the sites. At many of the sites, those solstice and equinox alignments are embedded in the architecture as well. So as to the question, why would they care about the lunar astronomy? I mean, the solar astronomy is really obvious for agricultural people. It's the agricultural calendar. It's when do you plant? When do you sow? When do you harvest? But the moon on an 18.6-year cycle, I mean, who would even care? Who would want to keep track of that or even spend the generations that it would take to learn that this was a repeating cycle? Well, I think this quote by the late Vine Deloria Jr. Is key. And he's writing here not about ancient earthworks or mounds. It's an essay about American Indian architecture in general. But I think it applies beautifully here. He says, whenever possible, the larger cosmos was represented and reproduced to provide a context in which ceremonies could occur. Thus, people did not feel alone. They participated in cosmic rhythms. And standing in that gateway, watching the moon rise in that alignment, you feel like you're participating in cosmic rhythms. So some of the implications of the geometry and the astronomy that's embedded in the Newark earthworks, and I'm talking about Newark particularly, the same geometry and astronomy you can find at some of the other earthworks in Chillicothe, in the Sioto Valley, but here it's all put together in a singular composition. So you see there's a common unit of measure used throughout. Each earthwork is different. That is, I think they're each specialized components. The great circle with its interior ditch filled with water, the circle and the octagon with its astronomical alignments, the great ellipse with all the burial mounds. Also, each earthwork is connected to another by that hidden geometry, as well as by some astronomical alignments. Therefore, the implications of this is, I think, that the Newark earthworks they were designed by a singular, extraordinary intellect, a male or female Imhotep or Michelangelo, as a ceremonial machine, the Hopewell equivalent, perhaps, of a superconducting supercollider, as something that would unleash primordial forces. And I think also the coherence of this design means it was built in a very short period of time under the supervision, perhaps, of that designer. So I think the Newark earthworks are a grand synthesis of the architecture, geometry, and astronomy of the earthworks in the Scioto River Valley, which are centered on modern Chillicothe. And the Great Hopewell Road, which I'm going to start talking about now, is partly a testimonial to that cultural connection. So here's the with some of those other earthworks that make up Hopewell culture or the Hopewell ceremonial earthworks that I think are sort of the origins of what later becomes the Newark earthworks. That's Mound City in the upper right. That's Hopeton in the lower right, or the lower right, and High Bank Works on the lower left. So you've got a circle and an octagon, a circle and a square, and a geometric figure jammed full of burial mounds. Those are components that you can find at Newark. So I think all of these things were worked out in Chillicothe and transposed as a whole, as a composition, 60 miles north at Newark. And then this is an image that's from the dossier that we wrote for our nomination for the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks that shows the OCD, and in some cases half of the OCD, and how it's embedded in all this architecture. You find it in all the sites that are in the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks except the Great Circle. So you find it at the Octagon Earthworks, which of course is where it was defined. The Hopeton Earthwork has that diameter of the circle that's 1,054 feet. Mound City, the diagonal lines across it are one OCD. Fort Ancient, which is mostly a hilltop enclosure and mostly not geometric at all, has 4 stone-covered mounds in the North Fort, which, if you draw lines between them, form a perfect square, 1/2 of the OCD inside. The sides of it measure that. So clearly, this speaks to that. There's a common unit of measure. These people could build monumental architecture to the same scale and to the same design over and over again throughout the regions where they lived. Now, the first mention, the first hint of something that you might refer to as the Great Hopewell Road was mentioned by Caleb Atwater in 1820. He wrote, he's talking about these parallel lines CD, which are the lines that are emanating there south of the Octagon. And Atwater sort of draws them incorrectly, kind of due south. But he says, I should not be surprised if those parallel walls are found to extend from one work of defense to another for the space of 30 miles. And he goes on to say that he's heard reports in between Newark and Circleville and Chillicothe of those lines being found at various points. But that's not like the only reference, though. He doesn't say where. It's not detailed in it. He's just sort of surmising. Won't be surprised if they do extend for as much as 30 miles, which is actually only half the way to Chillicothe. Squire and Davis, who wrote this map, they don't refer to Atwater. They don't refer to Atwater's claim about these walls might go in as much as 30 miles, but they show the parallel walls going due south, just like Atwater did, only not straight. They have them sort of squiggling. And the only reference in their work to how far those walls go is that note along the side of the walls that says parallels 2.5 miles long. Well, if you follow them 2.5 miles, you come to Ramp Creek. So clearly, Squire and Davis thought those walls ended at the river, just like the northern avenue that goes from west to east ends at Raccoon Creek, and the other walls over there by the burial mounds that come out there ends at the South Fork of the Licking River. So Squire and Davis showed that perhaps these walls just go to the first river that it comes to or something. And I assumed that that was right. I assumed that Squire and Davis not referencing Atwater's work meant that it wasn't worth mentioning, that they had determined that there were no continuation of the walls. But all that changed for me when I rediscovered this manuscript in the American Antiquarian Society's collections. This was a map drawn by James and Charles Salisbury in 1862. And in addition to the map, there was like a 22-page handwritten document describing all of these earthworks in great detail. And they say they followed those earthworks. In fact, maybe I've got this on my next slide. Yeah, there's James Salisbury. He actually is pretty famous. He goes on to invent Salisbury steak, but he was a local physician and an amateur archaeologist. He and his brother wrote, "We have traced those walls some 6 miles over fertile fields, through tangled swamps, and across streams, still keeping their undeviating course." Um, and then he says they traced them those 6 miles, but then like they said they're still going, but they went home for some reason. But if you think about it, people at that time, archaeologists at that time, weren't all that interested in ancient roads, even like the roads of Chaco Canyon, for example. They were just interested in the great monumental architecture, and the roads were kind of incidental and don't get serious study until quite a bit later. Well, this is me. You can play Where's Waldo and see if you can find me in either of those pictures. This is back in 1977 at Archaeology Field School at the University of New Mexico. And on the right, we're at Chaco Canyon. And this is at the Jackson Stairway, where these steps are carved, keeping a perfectly straight alignment. And this is up at the top, it connects with what's called the Great North Road at Chaco Canyon, which is a long, straight road. And many of the Chaco Canyon roads were very long and straight and could go for quite a distance. And I recalled this experience when I'm reading the Salisbury manuscript, and I'm thinking like, this could be a road like the Chaco Canyon roads, going perfectly straight for a long distance. I wonder where it would go. And this is long before GPS. I got USGS quadrangle maps for the whole area between Newark and the Chillicothe area, and used a ruler and protractor to draw the lines. And it seemed to point directly to Chillicothe, right to the center of Chillicothe. Not necessarily to any particular earthwork, but to the center of all the earthworks in that area. Also later learned about the Mayan Sakbeab, that were long straight roads that could go for many miles across the Yucatan Peninsula. And the Maya were still an active civilization, for example, when the Spanish arrived. And Spanish priests would ask, what are these long straight, limestone covered roads that go off to nowhere? And the Mayan people told them that those are sacred roads that connect one sacred place with another, and they are routes of pilgrimage. Well, the efforts to trace the Great Hopewell Road kind of end around 1870, when a guy named Samuel Park decided to trace them based on Atwater's claim. And he says he looked between Newark and Circleville, but with no success, and doubted that in the present improved state of the country, it could be found. So already the landscape is being developed, trees are being cleared, lands being plowed, and ephemeral earthworks are being erased from the landscape. Well, this is aerial photography in which, even though the earthworks were leveled, the crop marks show up. This is 1930, and an aviation enthusiast in Newark named Warren Wyant Jr. flew over it and noticed these walls, that they were very straight parallel lines in the soil, extending from Newark's Octagon southwestward in a straight line for Millersport. And a later article in the Newark Advocate reported that airmen have reported seeing traces of a long passage running from Newark to Lancaster, which is basically what Atwater said, that the walls went that far. But here you get a clear sense that these walls didn't squiggle south like Squire and Davis mapped them. They are just exactly like the Salisbury brothers mapped them, perfectly straight for as far as Wyant traced them with this photography. And if you extend that in a straight line, as I said, it goes right into Chillicothe, pretty much following the line of that arrow. And the circle down there is High Bank Works. Above it is Hopeton. Mound City is across the river from Hopeton. So that, as I said, it doesn't seem to point to any particular earthwork. Although I gave a presentation like this for the Ross County Historical Society at one point. Chillicothe is in Ross County. And one of the curators of the collections there said, that arrow is pointing to one of the most important historic era fords of the Scioto River. And it occurred to me that that might not be a coincidence. So there's the close-up of the High Bank Works, which you've already seen, and you've seen the astronomical alignment on its alignments that are associated with that, just as the circle and octagon in Newark. I've diddled with that city sign over there, the Chillicothe, the first capital of Ohio. I put the old dates for the Hopewell, 100 BC to AD 400 there. That refers to when Chillicothe was the first European American capital of Chillicothe. But the other map is Ross County that shows the profusion of mounds and earthworks contained in Ross County. There are probably more mounds and earthworks in Ross County than any other single county in Ohio. And I think that's going to have an important point to make from that here in a moment. Well, right now, in fact. This is from a guy named Timothy Price. He talked to me about a project and wanted to do a project about the Great Hopewell Road. And so he did a GIS analysis. And here you see mound density in Ohio, and the black line is my projected route of the Great Hopewell Road. And of course, Newark up there is that big concentration of mounds and earthworks. And down in the bottom left is the huge concentration in the Scioto Valley. And in between, there's almost nothing. So it seems like there's one obvious destination. It's pointing directly to Chillicothe. And if the road doesn't extend all 60 miles and connect it, it is at the very least, a symbolic representation of this is where we come from. These sites are connected by this alignment. But I think the road extended that far, and we're still accumulating evidence, because you remember the last firm evidence we had was the Salisburys that said they traced it for 6 miles. And then aviation folks traced it for maybe another, 10, 20 miles, maybe down to Chillicothe. Not to Chillicothe, to, what was it, Millersburg, I guess, that they were talking about, which may have been 10 or 12 or something. Well, now, Jamie Davis, who's an archaeologist for the Department of Transportation, using LIDAR, has found remnants as far as like the southernmost point in Licking County. So this is a point where this is like 8 miles south of the Octagon, where they're firmly there. So back when I was originally promoting the idea, I could only document the walls for sure 6.5 miles through the words of the Salisburys. Now we can say they definitely went at least 8 miles. And Jamie hasn't looked further south, because the end of Licking County is where like the highest quality LIDAR is available, and from the state database. South of the Licking County border, they don't have that upgraded LIDAR available yet. When it is, people can look further south to see if there's continuing remnants there. So both of these earthworks, the Newark earthworks, or the Octagon earthworks and the High Bank works, have these astronomical alignments as integral to their architecture. This is that same quote again, which I don't know why that's showing up again, unless I'm going backwards. This is when I've looked for American Indian oral traditions that might say something about the earthworks, or perhaps even the idea of long straight roads connecting these earthworks. I've only found a few things, but they're very intriguing. This is David Zeisberger, a Moravian minister, writing in his History of the North American Indies in 1780. And he wrote, when the chiefs among the Indians lay out a trail several hundred miles through the woods, they cut away thorn and thicket, clear trees, rocks, and stone out of the way, cut through the hills, level off the track, and strew it with white sand, so they may go from one nation to another. And then Zeisberger goes on to say, well, of course, there are no roads like this, so this must be made up by the chiefs. It's not true. But it so much evokes the Sakbeb of the Maya, which translates as white road. This road paved with white sand. and a long straight road that's been cleared suggests to me that this could be an echo of some of the traditions that might relate to something like the Great Hopewell Road. The Reverend Albert Secoquin Anthony, a Delaware Indian, reported to, oh, what was the anthropologist's name? Daniel Brinton. He repeated this tradition. In the good old times, before any Europeans had landed on their shores, the Lenape, or the Delaware, had something, I can't, a string of white wampum beads which stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And on this white road, their envoys traveled from one great ocean to the other, safe from attack. And this is ambiguous, but it does seem to reflect the notion of a straight white road that connects places safe from attack is inappropriate because during the Hopewell, there's no sense that there's any warfare. But still, that sense in a more recent historic context of being safe from attack is a kind of a nod to a sacredness to it. That, like when you're carrying white wampum beads, it means you're an ambassador and you can't be molested and you can travel from one place to another safe from attack. So maybe this is another kind of an echo of that. And finally, more specifically, in this account, these Creek oral traditions, the Creeks were in the southeastern United States. The Creek oral history repeatedly mentions that the Creeks traditionally went north to special mounds for pilgrimages in spring and autumn. Doesn't say how far north, although they do mention that the Chadburys do mention Ohio in another reference. So maybe this is a reference that the Creek ancestors are traveling to the Ohio Valley for pilgrimage to see these amazing places, to participate in the ceremonies there. These places, and one of the reasons why I think these were pilgrimage centers and not community churches, is their scale, their very scale. This is the Great Circle when it was made the county fairgrounds. There was a grand reunion of the soldiers and sailors who lived in Ohio, who'd served from Ohio in the Civil War, held here after the Civil War. And accounts from the Cincinnati newspapers say 20 to 30,000 people gathered inside the Great Circle. That's not a community church for the Middle Woodland period. Community churches would be no bigger than the small circles built by the previous Adena culture that were only like 200 feet across. These enclosures, I think, were built so gigantic is because they were expecting thousands of people probably coming from the ends of the world, bringing offerings of these precious raw materials to come to these places. I'm going to skip that one. So this is my notion, is that the Newark Earthworks, as well as many of the other, perhaps all the other large Hopewell earthworks, were places of pilgrimage. And I often have people ask, like, why Newark? It's stuck way out there in the middle of the north, way far away from the rest of the earthworks. Why Chillicothe, for that matter? And what I would argue is that it's like asking why Mecca and why Jerusalem, but you don't have a Quran or a Bible to explain, to give you the story, the context for why it's there. But I think these were places like that. Their scale, their grandeur is equivalent to these giant ceremonial places that are pilgrimage centers. And I think 2,000 years ago, these were places of pilgrimage. It explains a lot. It explains why people are coming from the ends of the world. It explains why the architecture is so vast and expansive. So was there a Great Hopewell Road that extended 60 miles and connected ancient Newark to Chillicothe? Or am I hunting for a snark that may be a boojum? This is actually my latest paper on the subject. It's been published by the Ohio Archaeological Council in their Journal of Ohio Archaeology. You can go to ohioarchaeology.org and click on the What We Do up there in the upper right and come down to Publish, and it'll give you the dates. And so you click on 2024 and you can come across this paper that's kind of like a biased assessment, as I've called it there, 30 years on from when I originally proposed it. So it's a review of the evidence, a review of the history, and an assessment where we are today in whether this is an accepted idea or whether it's people are still skeptical about it. And we're in between there. Some people are still skeptical. Some people have come to a greater acceptance of it. But I refer you to that paper for more information. And finally, I post this on all my presentations now. This is Bryant Robinance, a comedian from the UK, who does a podcast with the physicist Brian Cox. It's called The Infinite Monkey Cage. I highly recommend it. He said this during one of the programs, and I just love it. Science is not about this is right. It's about saying this is definitely the least wrong version of events we have for the time being. So I think the notion that the Great Hopewell Road was a connection between these far-flung earthworks and that it was a route of pilgrimage that connected these places is, in my view, the least wrong version of events we have for the time being. And finally, a quote from Chief Wallace of the Eastern Shawnee tribe, who was instrumental in helping us make these sites inscribed on the World Heritage List. She says these earthworks are miraculous. I want to thank James Reed for the invitation to be here. Thank you all. I presume we've got a few questions, so let's go on to them.
Oh, great, Brad. That was really wonderful. You've kept everyone's attention through the whole thing. Let's see. There was a talk at Octagon last week about the Hopewell artifacts at the British Museum. Is there any hope that these artifacts could go on tour to Ohio?
They have been to Ohio. I think it was back in the 70s or early 80s. Some of the artifacts, the Hopewell pipes from Mound City, were on display for a time here. But whether that can happen again, it remains to be seen. No one is really working towards that end right now, but Dr. Laura Murphy, who did that presentation, I think is very interested now and is developing a relationship with the British Museum where they're working together. She's providing tribal nations with information about material from their cultures, their tribes that are in the British Museum. Hopefully helping to get the British Museum to at least interpret the materials that they have in a better way that involves input from indigenous tribes. But no, I don't think we have that kind of a exchange right now on the horizons even right now, but maybe.
And Susan would like to know, does the road between the two areas or mounds align with anything celestial? We might have covered that.
Well, there is something extra to that. So let me answer that, and then you can maybe tell the rest of it. It's not new. It was originally the idea was originally formulated by Dr. Bill Remain, and if you have that straight alignment, and I think it was Ray Hyvel and Robert Horn who first observed that alignment is exactly orthogonal or at right angles to the sunset on the summer solstice. Bill Remain's contribution was sort of using technology to wind the sky back to 2,000 years ago. And apparently, at around AD 100, I think he used, when the sun sets on the summer solstice and the sky darkens, the Milky Way at 100 CE would be in perfect alignment with the Great Hopewell Road. So if you were standing in the Great Hopewell Road, it would appear to continue up into the sky in front of you and up into the sky behind you.
Wow.
And I find that a marvelous notion.
Yeah. For the Maya, that was the pathway that you would take once deceased. You would rise up into the Milky Way. Is there any information that suggests why the exact Newark site was chosen for the consolidated geometric figures and alignment?
No, and I mean that goes back to what I've already said about, why Mecca, why Jerusalem. Although Newark is an exceptional place, it's the flattest place you can get, close to the Flint Ridge Flint source, which was important for the Hopewell and probably sacred. It's also surrounded by water. You've got the Raccoon Creek and the South Fork of the Licking River and Ramp Creek. that form like almost a triangle that sort of surrounds the site with water, which makes it kind of a microcosm of the creation story, with the earth being, or the middle world being right in the middle of this water world, the beneath world. And then there's this glacial Kettle Lake in the middle of the earthworks there that also was probably an entryway into the beneath world. So all kinds of little reasons why everything came together here. But as to why Newark and what's not some other nearby place, it's got to have something to do with the unrecorded history of that place and the person, the charismatic individual, the Buddha, the Moses that came up with this idea to make this incredible creation at this place. And I don't know that we can ever know that.
Yeah. Um, could there have been roads from Chillicothe to other distant earthworks, like at Portsmouth or Cincinnati?
Yes, Portsmouth has all kinds of earthworks going off. One of the earthworks goes down and crosses the Ohio River and connects to a enclosure in Kentucky. One of the earthworks at Portsmouth, Squire and Davis didn't trace to its end. It just goes off sort of towards the northwest, and it just sort of dribbles away. Um, it was Roger Kennedy, who was director of the National Park Service and for a time director of the Smithsonian Museum of American History. He speculated in his book Hidden Cities that those walls could have connected with the Great Hopewell Road in Chillicothe and just be another expanse of the Great Hopewell Road. And I just wanted him to separate that as a distinct thing. I said, for me, the Great Hopewell Road is this connection between Newark and Chillicothe. If it connects with other sites, then let's call it, give it a different name. But there are supposedly stories of walls at the Fort Ancient site that went off in different directions that simply haven't survived. So if there was one Hopewell Road, of course there would have been others. And we know this kind of parallel walled avenue is found at all kinds of Hopewell sites. Often they just go down to the river, just like Squire and Davis assumed in many cases. But in many cases, they could have gone farther. But people back in the 1800s weren't that interested in studying ancient roads. They were more interested in focusing on Pueblo Bonito and the Great Circle and the Octagon. And the roads were kind of interesting, but they were very peripheral to the interests of people back then. And it wouldn't have taken much more than several decades, a century, for those traces of ancient roads to be lost completely. And I think many have been lost.
Huh. Michelle says I'm originally from Ohio, and she doesn't ever recall hearing about the mounds or the road. Are there more efforts today to educate students and Ohioans in general about this incredible heritage?
Oh my goodness, this is a story I've been hearing all of my career. And one of the goals for me, especially, and for many of the people I've worked with, to get the Newark Earthworks inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List was to do exactly this, to make them more prominent in the world. And for me, with my Newark focus, I wanted people like that car dealer across the street to know what we have in this community. And when they see, as they will in coming years, numbers of people, coming from all around the world to see these places, it may give them a notion that, well, gee, maybe these things are important. Maybe we do have something precious and extraordinary right in our own backyards that we have not appreciated because they're just mounds of dirt, as they're often called. And my response to that has become, the Newark earthworks are mounds of dirt in the same way that the Parthenon is a pile of rocks.
Mike says, Brad, thanks for everything you have done for these amazing places of ceremony and meaning. They always take me away. They must be seen in person. Photos just can't do it.
That's absolutely true. That's why I hope as many of you as possible can come and experience these sites. And you don't have to dodge golf balls at the Octagon now.
And Alex, our Venus man, as you mentioned that some structures likely align with the sun and or the moon. Is there any evidence for alignments to other celestial bodies such as Venus?
Well, Ray Hively and Robert Horn, who have been doing most of the research, they've been looking at the low-hanging fruit. That is, the moon and the sun are rising basically the same place now that they were 2,000 years ago. So those are the alignments they can check. They thought it was more speculative to look for planetary alignments or stellar alignments, although people are starting to talk about those now. Um, uh, Giulio Magli talks about the Great Hopewell Road also being aligned to the rise of Capella, which is like the sixth brightest star in the sky, which could have been used as a way to sort of align the construction. You wait, you build it in a straight line as far as you can and wait till night. And then when Capella rises, you've got the place marked the destination again. So there are, I think, conversations now. People are exploring other kinds of astronomical alignments. And given the fact that the Maya were doing all this, it wouldn't surprise me at all if we will be finding alignments to Venus, alignments to stars at the Hopewell Earthworks as well. But so far there's hasn't been very much documentation or even very much attempt to do that.
And that probably answers Robert's question, how would the straight line road be laid out?
Yeah, I mean straight lines, I mean like the long straight roads in Chaco Canyon can be laid out with three guys with poles. And sort of you sort of make the wall straight, and then the guy in the back runs ahead and goes on further and lines up his pole with the rest. And you can project pretty straight lines with that. And then, of course, you could check them periodically with the rise of Capella or something like that. But it's not that difficult to project straight lines. It's a lot of work, but you can do it. And indigenous people could do it with poles.
Hmm. Excuse me. I'm eating pistachios here. Have you identified the unit of measure? How does it compare to units used elsewhere in the Americas?
Yeah, there's different people. Bill Remain, Jim Marshall, and some others have tried to sort of isolate the unit of measure. Hively and Horn sort of just stick with 1,054 feet as being a key component, but what the Hopewell yard or meter was, I don't think we know yet. We'll have to excavate a mound and find a Hopewell meter stick or something that will help us sort all that out.
And great talk, Brad. Those ethno-historic references are a great addition to your argument. Any future archaeology or exploration of the parallel walls?
Well, right now we're hoping to do more LiDAR work because that seems to show them best. So we want to get Fairfield County, which is just south of Licking County, get the high resolution LiDAR there and start looking there to see if we can pick out any remnants there. I think that's our best bet. The earthworks were only like 3 feet high and they were built by scraping soil around and piling them up. And when that gets plowed back, it doesn't leave much of a geophysical signature. So even if we sort of picked a field and said the walls were here and did a geophysical survey of that, the walls wouldn't stand out very well. So I think we have to rely now on getting a nice survey. Maybe we could get some grant money and do an actually ultra high resolution LiDAR and fly maybe just the route of the road to see. Um, but so much development has occurred in between. I mean, I have high hopes that we'll be able to find remnants such as the remnants Jamie Davis with the Department of Transportation has been finding that nobody ever knew about before, and that has showed conclusively that they go at least 8 miles south. So I'm hoping that with more higher resolution LiDAR, we can find more traces and get a sense of how far it really went.
And they mentioned that the Hopeton Earthworks has a 2,200-foot long set of parallel walls.
Yes, and it's that also section of parallel walls seems to end at the river, and it doesn't connect directly with Mound City, but we do think they were built at about the same time, and that avenue may have been part of people going from Mound City, wading across the river or going at low stages and following the walls up, or perhaps taking rafts across or something. But it's generally thought that those two sites, even though they're on different sides of the river, are connected. And although the parallel walls don't point straight to Mound City, there's still a way to go to the river, and then the river can be a way to go to Mound City.
Hmm. Um, and Arnold says in other countries, cultures like Peru, the lunar calendar was female and the sun male. Do you find that at all with these mounds?
In some indigenous traditions, I mean, that's the case. I know the moon is often associated with first woman in many indigenous traditions. And the sun sometimes is her grandson, or I remember exactly what it is. But yes, there are those kinds of traditions. Exactly which ones of those can trace back to Hopewell, we may not be able to know, but there's the possibility that we can. Those traditions certainly can give us hypotheses or suggestions for what kinds of associations there may have been.
And I don't see any more questions. What Robert Mark, would you like to unmute and ask Brad your questions?
Yes, I can see if they started from the south with an astronomical alignment and worked their way to the northeast to determine where to build the major construction. I could understand how that could be done. But if you started from the north, I don't see how you could aim it accurately at a site 60 miles away in the southwest.
Well, unless you were sort of intimately familiar, had come from the south to the north, and knew that, for example, the star Capella would be rising directly where in the direction of Chillicothe, that would be one way to do it. And perhaps it was projected from the north or from the south to the north. I can't make any direct assessments about that. My sense is, though, that they would have come to the northeast, found the place, and then projected the road back. But that's just a guess.
Well, unless it had some specific astronomical alignment that they were following and working their way to the north east until they came to a good place to lay out the major construction.
Yeah, that could be a possibility too, sure.
So does that mean you're thinking that they're making the roads and then making the construction? Or would they just be connecting constructions?
It's hard. I'm speculating here entirely now, but it seems to me that the earthworks are built and then the road would have been projected to connect them with the other earthworks.
Yeah.
But it could all been part of one integral design, that the alignment could have been established even before the road was built. And then later, after they incorporated all the alignments and built all the architecture, the walls would have been projected along that alignment that had been predetermined. But it's all just speculation. I have no idea the order in which things happened.
Hmm. All right, well, there's no more questions in the chat. Thanks to the couple of people who've given me their email addresses to sign up for the Aztlander. And Brad, thank you for that, for inspiring people. This has been a really, really great talk. I'm sorry I had the space problems on my computer and the recording apparently went out. If I find it's anything serious, I'll contact you. I'm worried about finding the first part of the recording. Like, where did that go?
Okay. Well, I'll leave you to that. Good luck with that.
If
I'm glad it's not me having to find it.
All right, Ed and Brian, I say thanks. A great talk. So with
Well,
that,
thank you for inviting me.
yes, thank you once again. And with that, Susan says thanks for a great program. And I also, as well as everyone else, thank you. Thank you, Brad.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Take care, Brad.
Hey, thanks, Phil. Good seeing you.
Yeah, good seeing you too. That was really an outstanding talk. That was great.
Great, Brad.
As always.
Appreciate it very much.
Yeah. Take care now. Good night,
You too.
everybody.
Thanks again, Brad. And thanks for watching this Aztlander presentation. And please subscribe to our YouTube channel. To subscribe to free monthly issues of the Aztlander Magazine of the Americas, contact your host, Jim Reed, at jimreedmaya@gmail.com. Thanks again.